Welcome here to the Gamma Project. I am here sitting with one of my distinguished and all-around awesome client, Gemma Lamkin, all the way from, originally from the States, but currently residing in Amsterdam. Welcome, Gemma.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Happy to have you. Gemma, would you like just to start off the conversation for the viewers out there on what you would like to discuss today?
Sorry, Justin, you broke up quite a bit. Can you
No,
repeat what you said?
of course I can. So would you like to start off the conversation on the topic of interest for our viewers today?
Sure. So I can start maybe from a personal standpoint. So I've struggled with having polycystic ovarian syndrome, or PCOS as it's often called, for most of my adult life. It was actually misdiagnosed for many years when I was much younger as endometriosis. And then in my early 20s, they finally figured out that it was actually PCOS. And I have the type of PCOS, which is quite common, that comes with being insulin resistance. So I've struggled with my blood sugar and kind of being pre-diabetic for, as long as I have known that I've had the disease. So very interested to speak with you and hear your thoughts about how to best manage PCOS and all the misinformation that's out there. So that's how I would introduce the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you, Gemma. Well, first, before we get into ways and how we can deal with PCOS regarding nutrition, diet, and overall lifestyle, we need to just first, for our viewers out there, make them allow them to understand what PCOS really is and how it comes about. PCOS is generally, it's an acronym for polycystic ovary syndrome, but it's generally caused by high levels of androgens and or insulin in the body as well. It can come about from genetic prevalence toward it too, or it could possibly be created or caused by the birth cycle or the fetal position within one's maternal position. So how the mother, in other words, is engaged in stress can influence genetically how the fetus would also be able to adapt towards stress. And those changes in DNA, or the epigenetic factors to the changes in DNA, can influence how the body, in other words, would respond to the environment and subsequently create a balance or an imbalance to certain hormonal centers in the central nervous system. And in particular, we're talking about the hypothalamus over here as well. So it is due to multiple factors that can create the onset of PCOS. It's quite common. About 27% of females have PCOS. Most don't actually really ever get diagnosed accurately, like yourself, with the condition. And unfortunately, they never actually go about with the right type of treatment to help them with their hormonal position, along with possibly an imbalance to their stress position too. So generally, treatments, so there is no cure for PCOS, unfortunately, but a few treatment plans that have birth control pills that they like to recommend. I'm not too sure about that. Sometimes I feel like it can cause more of a havoc, and the reason why we'll go into a little bit later as to the organ systems that we need to consider, the state in which they're in, based on the fact of a case of PCOS. Metformin, another glucose regulating drug. It's a disposal drug used in generally type 2 diabetic cases. That's often also recommended or prescribed for those women with PCOS, as well as anti-androgens, so testosterone or androgen lowering compounds too. Now, these are all band-aids in my opinion. I don't feel as though they're actually going to help the organ systems, let alone one of the main contributors that I believe is the culprit to ongoing and further progression of PCOS, and that namely being the position of the nervous system and its associated effect with the digestive system as well. So some of the symptoms before we get into that, some working oily skin, acne from elevated levels of androgens, thinning of hair, weight gain, darkening of skin, and skin tags, whatever that means, is one of the symptoms that they came up with in the research of that. So funny, one thing though to take note in all those symptoms also very closely associated with zinc deficiency in the body.
Mm.
Now, zinc deficiency is heavily noted when our cells in our stomach are not functioning to their maximal or their best potential. So when we have dysfunction occur in the cells within our stomach, zinc is generally not absorbed to the right efficiency that it should be absorbed. And this in particular can cause issue with acne as well as thinning of the hair because of its role that it has with the production and formation of DHT from androgen metabolism. Other risks, as you mentioned before, Gemma, potential of diabetes, high blood pressure, unhealthy cholesterol, sleep apnea, depression and anxiety, and endometrial cancer. Now, also very important to note is when it comes to cholesterol metabolism is also heavily dependent on the vitamin status of B12, as well as mineral status of both magnesium and zinc. Without those subsequent precursor vitamins and minerals, cholesterol metabolism becomes somewhat impaired, and we see an increased level of total cholesterol formulating in the body due to the liver not being able to have the raw material in order to emulsify certain fats and in essence also create better cholesterol metabolism through effective emulsification of fats as well. So that's with PCOS. Now, Jim, I don't know if you know much about the genetic positioning or the genetic predisposition that one has toward PCOS. Do you know much about
it? No, probably not.
Okay. Well, generally, so if you think about PCOS, can come about from insulin resistance, as it is in your case as well, right? If we look at insulin resistance as a cause, and we're trying to figure out factors to that cause, generally insulin resistance comes about when the body releases excessive amounts of glucose into the bloodstream in response to a stressor, in response to heightened levels of catecholamine release. Now, glucose low can also come about from dietary influence. This is simple sugars, additives, preservatives, particularly stimulant-based additives like S1K or aspartame, right? That can all induce heightened levels of glucose released into the bloodstream. But in particular, when we think about glucose that's released to the bloodstream, we think about energy mobilization, all right? So the body is going to release more glucose into the bloodstream for the purpose of increased circulation of available substrates required for ATP production, right? And this comes about from when stress hormone is released into the bloodstream, or into our physiology through implication or through a role of the central nervous system's coordination with the peripheral nervous system. All right, so the communication that our control centers have with our periphery, in essence, is what's going to warrant either a heightened stress response or a more balanced stress response itself. Now, something that I did a bit of research into prior to us having this cool, absolutely awesome topic of conversation is generational stress inheritance. So it's basically when genes are altered, so an epigenetic factor is altered during a woman's pregnancy, and how the fetus can change their affinity towards methylation of the DNA sequences of nucleotides. So that sounds all fancy, big words, but in essence, how we are able to methylate is also going to influence how our genes respond, how we can switch certain genes on or switch to certain genes off. Now, in an environment of stress, either during pregnancy or actually early adolescence, our epigenetic factors start to create an effect and influence and effect to our DNA, which can make us more susceptible to stress. In other words, we turn on certain systems and certain subsequent reactions within our physiology in order to cope with stress. So our systems are more in tune with the fact that we need to get away or we need to fight against something. So in other words, in these cases, we release more catecholamines than a person that may not necessarily have had as much of a traumatic childhood or a traumatic pregnancy during the pregnancy for the mother. So there's a few things that can be influenced by transgenerational stress inheritance, and one of those three major factors that actually relate really closely to PCOS. And the first of those are estrogen receptor alpha changes, which is going to influence the way in which in your case, the ovaries are able to produce estrogen as well as balance off luteinizing hormone too. So that's one of the biggest changes that occurs through changes to DNA methylation. The second to that, which is very closely linked to the reason why I don't believe that the best diet plan to give someone with PCOS is a high-fat, low-carb plan. We'll go a little bit more into detail behind the gastric implication of a high-fat, low-carb plan, as well as the impact to hepatocytes and erythrocytes in a moment. But the second most prominent factor to poor methylation through transgenerational stress inheritance is glucocorticoid receptor sensitivity is heightened. So in other words, how our adrenals, our function towards stress, that reaction becomes extremely exacerbated. So we release more catecholamines than we should to try and get the energized effect that, say, person X may have had, being able to get with half the amount of glucocorticoids being released. And then to that as well, through glucocorticoid release, we also have mineral corticoid receptors also being influenced, which is going to affect our renal health and the status of our kidneys. Which is also going to affect the ability for our body to get rid of excessive uric acid, so the state of our erythrocytes too. Now, given what I've just said, when it comes to the digestive system, in order to break down and assimilate different macronutrients, by far the most complex macronutrient to break down is that of protein structures, particularly because they have a high quantity of nitrogen in them as well. And in order to go through the subsequent pathways of protein metabolism, we need to have activity of gastrin occur in the right segment of digestion. Interestingly, though, however, gastrin is inhibited when we have a high stress index in the body. Okay. What this does is through inhibiting gastrin, we also inhibit parietal cell function, which releases HCl, as well as activating pepsinogen to active form pepsin, which is one of the main digestive enzyme responses responsible for the breakdown of protein structures. So in a traditional avocation of a high-fat, lower-carb diet plan, in the case of PCOS, one also needs to take into account the other positions of the renal position as well as the adrenal position, which are generally going to be heightened to be a culprit or additive culprit to the impaired function of the ovaries to be able to register estrogen profile and androgen profile, and also allow for better metabolism of luteinizing hormone and subsequent release of follicle stimulating hormone to occur in the right space or in the right estrogen cycle. So what we often neglect to remember in case of PCOS is the stress position. All right, and which is quite crazy in my point of view, because one of the biggest culprits to PCOS is stress itself. Hence the reason why someone becomes insulin resistant over a period of time due to excessive exposure of stress stimulus. So we really need to focus on the fact that those who have PCOS have decreased stress tolerance. And dietary interaction due to decreased stress tolerance needs to be really thought out and taken into account toward how the metabolic cycle, the digestive cycle, takes precedent to acid position within the stomach and subsequent positive alkaline position in the small intestine. But in order for actions to be complementary with one another, we need to attain a certain position of an acid-like chyme through digestion in the stomach, which is not necessarily achieved to the best position in a state of reduced stress tolerance. So what do we do? Gemma, considering you've been on the Gamma project now for a few months, you've definitely lost quite a bit of body fat, and you've increased your performance through a few of your lifts as well. Fortunately, you're recently a little bit injured, but you know, as all gifted athletes, unfortunately, have to deal with injuries sometimes. But nonetheless, I think that we can safely say that your perception of stress has shifted, firstly, and your performance has improved.
Yeah, I think definitely managing the stress has a noticeable effect on my fasting glucose for sure. Don't yet see it in the, I always forget, is it the H1BC test?
Yes, HB1AC, that's right.
HB1AC. But yeah, definitely see the effect in the fasting glucose. And yeah, when I'm more stressed, normally I immediately see that the glucose goes up for a while.
All right. So with the Gamma project, if you can just inform, especially ladies out there that are looking for a solution toward PCOS, what is the biggest difference in your diet having come on board with the Gamma project?
Probably eating carbs. So yeah, in most traditional PCOS advice circles, I wouldn't even say that it's high fat, low carb, because I think most people are still quite afraid of fat in general.
Which is even crazier to the position of liver health as well.
Yeah. So it's just like low everything basically.
Don't eat and hope to modulate stress. That's a great way of modulating stress by not eating.
You laugh, but pretty much. And so with the Gamma project, I think, well, one of the big differences is, of course, eating differently depending on your fasting glucose and your biometrics for that day. But also just more generally in the later part of the days, having more of a medium carb, low fat diet is the biggest difference. Because yeah, I still, even a few months into the program, I still need to get the idea out of my mind that eating carbs isn't a bad thing. But it seems to have a positive effect, so I keep listening to what you say.
I always say that they're actually going to put up a post today on my social media. I always say, don't cut the carbs, cut the crap, right? And what I mean by that is carbs aren't bad for you, right? It's the refined stuff that's terrible, right? That really causes complete distress to the gut. I just want to go back a second, because when you mentioned there, a lot of ladies that are suffering from PCOS generally don't eat much. You know, they deprive their calories, and they probably will go throughout periods of extended fasting more so than what they should. Now, what that does, Gemma, on a gastroendocrine level, when you don't eat and your body is more susceptible to stress, and there's a very close correlation to inheritance of predisposition to not handling stress very well and PCOS as well. Right? There's a very close inheritance between that transgenerational stress inheritance and PCOS. Now, if there is an altered capacity to handle stress already, and you're not giving the body food, the body is going to go into a heightened stress position to mobilize energy. So it's going to release more catecholamines than what it should in order to create balance in our blood sugar control. And in doing so, initially you might find that through catecholamine release, you'll dispose of glucose in the bloodstream, but eventually there will become surplus volume of glucose sent in the bloodstream, And in particular, if you are not insulin sensitive, the uptake of that glucose back up into cells for purpose of glycogen storage may not be as effective or efficient as you possibly want it to be. So going without food for periods of time can actually become detrimental to the autonomic nervous system's position, which dictates positions of stress or positions of calm or positions of reaction to digestion, if you want to look at it that way. Now, there are two major hormones we have to also consider in the digestive tract. Those are somatostatin and motilin. Now, they have opposing reactions within the body. Motilin, as it suggests, has more reaction towards gut motility and increases the transit time, allowing for nutrients to be absorbed, whereas somatostatin slows digestive time, allowing for nutrients to also be absorbed without having to have issues of diarrhea. So when we have diarrhea, there's generally an increased release of motilin present in the gastrointestinal tract, causing the villi or the intestinal border not to have the opportunity to truly absorb the nutrients or assimilate the nutrients, which is not good either. But in extreme cases of somatostatin, which is actually released during a stress response, right? And given the fact that PCOS is closely related to stress intolerance, generally the release of somatostatin may be even higher in those whom have PCOS. Now, an increased release of somatostatin is going to slow down gastric emptying, which may be beneficial for nutrient assimilation up to a point, but excessive positions of somatostatin is going to cause something called bowel toxemia. And there are a huge array of unwanted metabolites that are formed from bowel toxemia, and a lot of those metabolites also further influence the central nervous system and its way in which it corresponds action and reaction to controls of hormonal centers, in particular the hypothalamus as well. So not eating is terrible. Eating too little is also not going to be beneficial. And then on top of that, if you're only going to eat proteins and you really are going to abstain from fats or carbohydrates, proteins are very dense in their structure and they require a lot of energy to break down. Now, if your body is already in a state of stress, it's not necessarily going to be able to, or not necessarily going to want to give up excess or further energy for the breakdown of those protein structures. So what's going to happen? That protein isn't going to be fully metabolized, and you in essence are going to set yourself up with a position of unwanted bacterial growth. All right, and unwanted bacterial growth, in particular from animal protein structures, can cause a huge array of havoc in the body. In particular, H. pylori increase and Candida increase as well. And both of those are detrimental. Candida for the small intestine, it really causes the brush border to become inflamed, not allowing for nutrients to be absorbed, and it can also add to unwanted permeability of the border within the intestinal tract as well, allowing pathogens to enter into the bloodstream, causing unwanted immune effects, which can further complicate the issue of PCOS again. And then we have H. pylori, which is heavily seen in mold or undigested protein structures. And H. pylori embeds itself into the mucosal cells in the stomach, creating an alkaline effect by releasing bicarbonate through a complex process of taking certain amino acids from other elements from the pancreas and creating this effect with increased release of bicarbonate into the stomach. Now, that's not a good thing because the stomach wants to be almost a pathogen neutral zone. In order to do that, it has to be acidic. So when you create an alkaline environment in an acidic position or part of the body, what you in essence are doing is setting yourself up further protein maldigestion, which is going to add to unwanted bacterial growth, and the vicious cycle continues. And then in addition to that, so you're only eating protein, but then you're going without bouts of food for long periods of time. And that's also going to put added stress on the adrenal position to mobilize energy. Now, that adrenal position, apart from it hampering your kidneys and the uric acid levels as well, when you start to incorporate excessive adrenal use throughout the body, it also can cause complications to how well the body is able to develop certain inflammatory markers or hydration markers. So the excessive, in other words, it will cause an excessive release of glucocorticoids, which initially will create another release of mineralocorticoids. Now, that's fine for initially, but excessive release of either or is going to cause depletion in particular of magnesium. And magnesium, as far as the process of gluconeogenesis. So if you were going to try and access glucose through non-carbohydrate sources, or non-carbohydrate sources, let's just say, not to get too pedantic with all the literature, you are going to need magnesium. Magnesium is one of the most important minerals for the process of gluconeogenesis to occur, but it's also very important for regular glycolysis to occur. So without subsequent levels of magnesium, in particular B vitamins, which can heavily become depleted during elevated uric acid cycles, you're not going to utilize carbohydrates effectively. And the cells in which carbohydrates are actually accessed for the purpose of energy are actually found predominantly in the liver. All right, and the kidneys. But the kidneys only really access their utilization for carbohydrate metabolism after 48 hours of fasting without food. So generally, you're going to be utilizing hepatocytes as the main position where glucose access is taking place, either through glycolysis interaction or gluconeogenesis interaction as well. So it comes down to the state of the liver. All right, and now the liver, we have modification and conjugation pathways for detoxification, but one of the primary conjugation elements is that of glucuronic acid. And glucuronosyl transferase is also heavily depleted, and guess what? A state of dysbiosis. So now we have a really terrible scene, right? We're eating protein, which is not being metabolized properly because we're too stressed. And all that protein is creating havoc to the parietal cells in the stomach, which is further complicating protein metabolism. Then we're also having fermentation occur to that protein, which is creating more distress to unwanted bacterial overgrowth. Now, that unwanted bacterial overgrowth is also releasing toxins into the body, and those toxins consume glucuronic acid. Keep it as that. They actually consume levels of glucuronic acid. And as far as conjugation is concerned, glucuronic acid is probably the most universal of the conjugating precursors required for conjugated detoxification pathways in the body. So guess what? Now we're not able to detoxify properly either. Then, because we're not able to detoxify, we utilize more of our primary phase modification pathways in the liver as well, which further depletes methylators. And if you don't have enough methylators, right, in the body, in particular methylators that are going to aid folate metabolism, guess what? We're going to further impact levels of homocysteine, which are pro-inflammatory and reduce insulin sensitivity to an even greater effect than that just of PCOS alone. So by consuming a diet that is low in carbohydrate, when the body hasn't got the digestive capacity due to the stress position to metabolize more dense macronutrient structures, is in theory, it seems the right way to go, because if you're insulin resistant, don't have carbs, right? That's just generally the thought. If you can't, but insulin resistance doesn't come about from eating, well, generally it doesn't come about from eating a healthy amount of good carbohydrates. It either comes from excessive stress or excessive intake of drugs, adulterants, alcohol, stimulants, in particular, extreme amounts of stimulants, or excessive intake of refined sources of food, all right, or processed sources of food, which by way and large cause more of an impact to the state of flora in the gut, more so than their lack of nutrients. Obviously, the lack of nutrients is also going to have an effect on our body's ability from transamination of amino acids within the liver to production of neurotransmitters in the brain. We need nutrients for all these processes to take effect. So less nutrients is going to impact that, but more so the additives and the preservatives, they cause more of a havoc to the flora within our gut, starving healthy flora of essential glucose polymers that are required for their continued growth and health as well. So it's very important to firstly ascertain what is the main culprit that's causing the problem. Is the main culprit my insulin resistance? And what am I going to do about that? Am I going to stop eating carbs? All right, well, even in diabetics, even the diabetics that I help, type 2 diabetics, if you look at a general conventional diabetic diet, most of them will not advocate a high-fat, low-carbohydrate plan. They would advocate a very balanced meal structure, abstaining from not carbs, refined carbs, unhealthy sources of carbs. And this is the difference. This is why I say, don't cut the carbs, cut the crap, because it's the crap that's causing the problem. It's not the carbohydrates. And when we talk about crap, we're not just talking about food. We're also talking about undue excessive stimuli coming from one's environment. Looking into this computer screen being one of them. How much time do you allow yourself to be stimulated artificially by a blue screen? How many electromagnetic frequencies are in your bedroom before you go to bed? Small little things like that make a huge impact. And if we take the initiative to try and prevent ourselves from overexposure of excessive stimulus, overexposure of excessive amounts of refined sugars, preservatives, additives, and also keep the diet more balanced in terms of, another thing to also consider, Gemma, the nutrients that are actually utilized for carbohydrate metabolism, go figure, actually found in carbohydrates. Nature has a wonderful way of being efficient towards our digestion if we actually allow it to be incorporated into our lifestyles. The problem is that we don't have terraformed lifestyles. We have terrestrial formed lifestyles, and that we're so alien from our own natural existence that we're trying to find ways in which to correct our ailments or whatever they might be through these extreme measures, instead of just going back to nature. And if you do things the way nature intended, by having a bit more diversity of all macronutrients in the right time of the day with the right quantity as well, we can heal ourselves from a lot of these issues rather than creating more exacerbated issues through unwanted, excessive ongoing release of glucose, not from the intake of carbohydrates, but rather from the maldigestion poor digestion taking place through intake of a macronutrient that the body may not be able to handle in high quantities. Not to say it can't handle it, but in a predominant quantity, it may not be the most efficient for the body to handle.
Makes sense.
So, and another thing to also consider, Gemma, is going back to the position within the brain. So, when it comes to emotional trauma, either that the mother may have undertaken some way, some form during pregnancy, or during developmental stress, there are certain positions in the brain or segments of the brain, in particular the hippocampus as well as the thalamus, that correlate memory and emotion with one another. And this can also further impact the position of the hypothalamus and its reaction to stimulation of follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, estrogens, and androgens. Now, we are more susceptible to past occurrences, in other words, memories of trauma, when we are in a heightened sympathetic state. And the reason for that is our nervous system is so well in tune that if we were to be in nature, in a natural environment, out in the Sahara, playing with all the animals, maybe here in Africa, that's what I would do. Then what we might, you there, Gemma? Sorry, guys, we just dropped out there. The Wi-Fi signal unfortunately cut out. We were just talking about EMF, and unfortunately, I think the technological gods must have had it against us in that moment and decided, you know what? If you're going to badmouth everything we give you, we're not going to give anything to you at all. But hey, what a nice release that was on the brain for 1 millisecond.
Justin, can I interrupt you since we were already interrupted?
Yes, please.
But you talked a lot about the maternal trauma. Mm-hmm. But can it also be genetically from the father's side? Because in my family, high glucose, pre-diabetes, that's where it runs from the father's side.
Most definitely. I think the most dominant genes would be transferred from the parent that is probably in the best state of health during time of conception. So if your dad, for example, was more fit, more active, generally living a healthier lifestyle than your mom may have been during the time when they conceived you, his genes may have passed on in dominance rather than hers to you as well, which, I'm sure he's got a lot of good genes as well to be grateful for. But unfortunately, yes, when it comes down to stress tolerance, it's not just about the single generation of interaction. It's passed on. So it depends on like what the state of stress his mother may have been in, the state of stress that her mother may have been in, so on and so forth. So if you look at places or populations of people whereby they've had lots of war, or lots of times of extreme famine or extreme struggle in the world, as opposed to tropical regions in the world, there's a difference of where food has been more in abundance. There's been obviously, well, not until recent years, but less war. Then we may have found. You there, Gemma? You there, Gemma?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, perfect. So this froze there for a second.
Yeah, I'm here.
We may find that there's an altered genetic predisposition from one person to another in how well they can handle stress or their stress tolerance position as well. So yes, it doesn't necessarily mean when we talk about the mother, we're talking about generations of mothers and the impact that stress may have had on them to subsequent generations thereafter as well.
Okay.
One of the clear defining factors of poor stress tolerance is the polymorphism of a gene called the MTHFR gene. You can imagine what we used to think of that gene's name as being. I'm not going to use any bad language on the video, but generally it is a poor gene whereby folate isn't methylated effectively in the body, and this causes poor digestion of an amino acid called methionine, which heightens pro-inflammatory properties throughout the body. So those who have a genetic predisposition toward poor MTHF reaction generally will also have a more of an affinity toward poor stress tolerance as well. So if anybody wants to do a further gene test. But looking again, once again, if we look into the position of stress as a whole and its interaction with the hypothalamus and genetics that has a whole lot to play in that, in order to get the hypothalamus, which is going to have a close role with the ovaries as well as with your entire endocrine system towards sexual health, we need to also first ascertain how much stress, once again, the body is under. If we can modulate the position to be more parasympathetic rather than sympathetic in nature, the interaction that the hypothalamus may have with your ovaries would be far more balanced. In other words, not leading to exacerbation of your PCOS symptoms. Not to say we can reverse it, because unfortunately, apparently there's no cure, but I'm sure that we can better the performance and the health within the lives of women with PCOS, so long as they take the stance rather on just following a dietary strategy, following a stress-free strategy. And that incorporates everything from how you move. You know, Gemma, since you started the program, we've been doing so much more stretching, more yoga-based stretching, more recovery work. And all these factors, apart from just the nutrition, play a huge role in how your brain is perceiving stress and how much parasympathetic stimulation is coming into your body to help contend with the ongoing issue of your PCOS as well. So I think the most vital thing to take from this, Gemma, is rather than trying to have a one-size-fits-all approach, right? Follow a high-fat, low-carb diet or follow a high-protein diet, which for the most part doesn't work for 9 out of 10 women suffering from PCOS. It really doesn't, for obvious reasons, as we just mentioned, you know, from gastric endocrine dysfunction to imbalance of biotic position within the flora of the gut. So, you know, rather follow a lifestyle plan that's going to have controlled bouts of stress so that you get a better adaptation to it, not excessive, right? If you haven't ever trained and you're going to the gym, you're going to try and do an hour of lactate training. It's not going to be beneficial for you, right? But if you go into the gym and you gradually do 16 minutes of lactate-based training, Tabata-based training, and then next week you do 20 minutes and you gradually build it up, but keeping a close eye on your biometrics to see whether or not the stimulus has been too much, when to hold back, that is a better strategy to take. And then with modulation of stress or metabolism of catecholamines, in particular the metabolism of cortisol, we actually really do need the substrate of pyruvate in order for oxaloacetate to take effect during the conjugation pathways of cortisol. If we don't, generally cortisol can cause even further havoc to the liver cells, damaging the micelle cells within hepatocytes, which are actually responsible for bile production. All right, so now we have just added to the list of unwanted symptoms, we have bile dysfunction as well if we do not have the right amount of healthy carbohydrates coming into the system for the purpose of liver function as well. And the liver is responsible for the health of the pancreatic islets too. So a stressed out body is going to be a stressed out liver, which is going to cause fatty acid buildup in the liver, or fatty liver syndrome, as I'm sure you've heard before, which is going to affect the islets of the pancreas, which are responsible for the release of insulin as well as the release of glucagon. And both of those are responsible for monitoring glucose in a neutral environment. In other words, an environment that we should be living in, but unfortunately we don't in the modern day world, whereby you're just going about your day without a lion trying to eat your leg off, or a computer screen trying to munch your brain off, and the glucagon releases when it should, insulin releases when it should, and everybody's hunky-dory in the homeostatic norm. But that is very much dependent on the state of the liver. And then once again, the state of the liver is also very much dependent on the health of the parietal cells. So if you're going to compromise your gut, particularly the first point of entry into the gut, by giving your body what it just hasn't got the position to metabolize due to your stress position, you're going to compromise a lot of other organ systems and your overall immunity toward ongoing exacerbated symptoms coming from PCOS. Any questions?
Cool.
Do you have any questions for our ladies out there? Are there any common symptoms or problems or anything that you'd like to ask about?
Yeah, I think we talked a lot about the glucose and the insulin resistance side of things. I don't so much have a problem with it, but I know a lot of women with PCOS really struggle more with the imbalance of the hormones. So having like very high testosterone, for example.
And the subsequent like acne, hair growth, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, indeed. What, because at least from my understanding, there's kind of two schools of thought in PCOS. So one is that it all starts from the insulin resistance, and okay, that's what wreaks havoc on your hormones. And then there's another school of thought that says, no, it's the hormones that are imbalanced first, and then that's what happens, that's what disrupts the glucose. Do you have any thoughts or suggestions for women who are struggling with more the hormonal part?
I think first and foremost, it's neither the insulin resistance nor the imbalance of hormones that's the problem. It's the nervous system that's the problem. It's the imbalance of neurotransmitters that's the problem that causes the onset of all these ailments to occur in the first place. And once again, the imbalance of neurotransmitters comes about from excessive stimulation or excessive sympathetic position. So in terms of those ladies out there that are suffering from hormonal imbalance, there are certain measures you can take to help as well. Fenugreek is a great addition, nutraceutical intervention for it, as well as chastery also helps, which we actually spoke about a little bit this morning, helps as well. One of my favorites to recommend for clients, female clients suffering from either PMS or from imbalance of hormonal structure during PCOS is chastery. And you don't have to use it on an ongoing basis. You really only need to use it when symptoms start to prevail. Those who with excessive symptoms like hair growth may want to use it on an ongoing basis to help deter the elevated levels of androgens. But it's very important to understand as to why the levels of androgens elevate in the first place. It's not because the body just says, okay, cool, let's get the parathyroid glands just to release a shitload more testosterone for no apparent reason. It's because estrogen levels are extremely heightened. All right. And the reason why they're excessively heightened is because the natural menstrual cycle becomes impaired or compromised. And the reason, one of the biggest reasons why estrogen or the menstrual cycle does become compromised, in particular particular cases of PCOS, is due to the fact that the metabolism or the conjugation of certain hormones isn't taking place effectively. So the body isn't recognizing, there isn't enough of a relay going to the brain to recognize the position of FSH and in particular LH. And because of that, it's not being metabolized effectively too. Reasons why it's not being metabolized effectively, we obviously have the cysts within the ovaries itself that create an abundance of certain effective progesterone and prolactin as well, which can create inflammation in the body, so hormonal reactions. But most importantly, I think it's down, in my opinion, it's due to the fact that the liver has eventually become compromised. Now, as you mentioned, if you would first start off with impaired glucose tolerance, right, and then later on, you're more likely to go to an hormonal imbalance. But you say some people think it's a hormonal imbalance that causes the glucose intolerance. Okay, whichever it is, at the end of the day, excessive amount of glucose is going to cause stress to the liver, which is going to cause issues with hormonal metabolism, because all hormones have to metabolize through the liver itself. All right, and if you have impaired primary modification or secondary conjugation pathway inefficiencies due to the state of the hepatocytes not being healthy, then you are going to have elevated levels of returning toxins into the body. And those returning toxins are also going to compromise how well reactions to certain hormones, because hormones are, in essence, the keys that unlock certain gates or channels, right? And you may have a hormone that unlocks another gate or channel to another hormone before getting to a final destination or outcome of a physiological outcome and response, right? A classic example would be FSH, LH, estrogen, right? And then estrogen will be metabolized, and then progesterone will be increased. And then progesterone gets to a certain point, and then FSH will be released, and so on. The cycle will continue. However, if there's disruption due to the fact that a hormone cannot create its subsequent effect into a certain receptor, it's generally going to be due to the fact that the liver is in a compromised state of health. And as you mentioned before, the liver is probably the organ that is impacted due to status of dysbiosis more so or more directly than the subsequent other organs that are associated with liver health as well, like the kidneys or the adrenals too. So when we have dysfunctional liver health, initially we'll have a dysfunctional adrenal position, which will lead on to dysfunctional erythrocyte metabolism or filtration as well.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
and then
does that answer the question for those ladies?
It does. It does. And then one more question, if you can. So there's also a lot of debate in the PCOS community about what kind of training to do. So, of course, you talked a lot about the importance of bringing more parasympathetic activity, into our plan at least. Mm-hmm. But there's some people who are like, no, you should be doing a lot of strength training, and that's the best thing for PCOS. And other people who say, no, don't do any strength training, only light conditioning every single day of the week. Okay, I have my own personal way of training, which we don't need to get into, but what do you think? What would you advise to more clients with PCOS, how to go about their training?
Everyone's an individual, regardless of their ailment or their pathology they have to deal with, all right? And the reason why I say that is it all comes down to how your body responds to a stressor. Right? If you do an abundance of heavy compound lifting and your autonomic position is saying, I'm cool, this is great, I'm actually switching things on, I'm not creating hypertonicity in the body, and I'm also creating subsequent inflammation in the body, which can be a deterrent to, or can be an additive factor to PCOS or the proliferation of symptoms of PCOS. And it says, no, I'm cool. This is the right type of stimulus. Then go ahead. do weight training, do high intensity, do kickboxing, go and fight in a cage, whatever tickles your fancy. I mean, so long as your autonomic nervous system, and that's what it comes down to, in my opinion, especially when it comes to digestion and the position of how well we are able to assimilate. It's not about the calories you eat, it's about the calories you assimilate. All right, it's the nutrients you assimilate. If you're just focused on calories, and you're not considering assimilation, you're never really going to get there. You know, some people may. You might have 10% of a case study get results just for focusing on calories, but the other 90% are going to be at a loss because they're not considering assimilation. Now, the autonomic nervous system is what allows or determines assimilation. If your stimulus, training being one stimulus, right? And there's so many stimuli that come to us every single day of our lives, especially living in this hectic world that we live in nowadays. You got to consider everything, right? So exposure, once again, to artificial interface, right? You got to consider exposure to additives in food, GMOs in food, pollution in a given environment where you're living in the world, the type of water that you drink. All these factors that add up to it. But in terms of training, it's probably the most controllable factor that you have control over. All right? The fact that you have the most control over. And I think that any form of training can be beneficial so long as the autonomic position doesn't become excessively sympathetic. If the autonomic position becomes sympathetic due to exposure of a stimulus, you're going to have impact not only on your ability to continue to perform at a high level, but you're going to have impact on your ability to assimilate nutrients. And nutrient assimilation is the key answer to, correcting a lot of diseases out there. So, autonomic position in terms of exercise selection. If your body does better or does well off yoga, and your position between parasympathetic and sympathetic balance is nice and level, do yoga. If you can sustain weight training, do weight training. Or what you could do is what we do in the Gamma Project as well, as you know, Gemma, certain days we'll say, great, the position is awesome, let's go for it, have some sympathetic stimulus. Other days, the position is not so good. Okay, just do some stretching, do some body weight, very light calisthenics, not at a rapid fashion or pace. Just get the tissue moving. Go for a massage. Go for a sauna. Just chillax. Don't smoke any pot because that's not going to make you relax in the right way. Man, I get it all from my clients. I swear. I recommend. I have new clients.
Are you implying that because I live in Amsterdam?
You know what? It's funny you say that because all my clients in Amsterdam are probably the least likely to use drugs. The clients of mine that are recreational drug users, marijuana predominantly, actually don't live in Amsterdam. That's crazy. It's mind-blowing. But they do live in London, which is, bombarded with a lot of stimulus, and I can understand why they want to switch off. However, maybe that's not the best route to take in switching off. Massage can do a hell of a lot better, and it's probably cheaper as well in the long run to your state of mental health, at least anyway. But yeah, so that's the key right there. There is no one size that fits all. When in my early days of bodybuilding, I used to just destroy myself regardless of how I felt, to the detriment of where I am now. Because now it's a constant battle of re-engaging structural balance, a constant battle of trying to position my autonomic nervous system into a healthy position. But luckily I got it when I was 32 and not 52. Which a lot of people unfortunately wait that long to get the help in the right position to be able to move forward with progressive health.
Cool.
So autonomic position, exercise selection or exercise type selection. Autonomic position, how well you can handle calories, as well as what type of macronutrients need to be contained in those calories.
Yeah, makes sense.
Cool. Is there anything else you want to ask, Gemma?
No, I think you educated us all very well, so thank you for that.
You're very, very welcome. It was a really interesting topic to try and bring ideas together to create a whole new hypothesis Because I always knew this to be true. And when it came to, you're not my first client with PCOS. It's quite common, like you said before. But I always knew it to be true because every single time a client came to me with PCOS, they always followed a high-fat, low-carb diet plan, and yet their symptoms weren't getting better. So I knew that wasn't the right way to go, because if so many people are doing something yet nobody's getting the right reaction from it, then certainly there must be a problem with the process. And then, given the opportunity, I was able to piece the pieces of the puzzle together. Thank you very much for posing the question to the audience and to all the ladies out there who can hopefully use this information toward a better hormonal position and glucose position as well.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks, Justin.
Thank you guys for joining in. This is yet another segment of the Gamma Project here. Stay tuned. We have many more interesting topics coming up for discussion regarding everything from biochemistry to kinesiology, just to general good living and overall lifestyle. Thank you guys. Take care and have a great day. Bye, Gemma.